Hi, everybody. This is a video to review the major concepts and ideas from Unit 7 in your biology course. This review is taking place specifically for the MCAS review. So we'll really just highlight some of the main ideas from this unit in preparation for that MCAS you'll be taking in June. All right, so let's get started. So just a couple of things to review before we get too much into it, but what is an ecosystem? So what an ecosystem is it's the interaction of living or biotic things and non-living or abiotic things in a specific location. And so remember that, biotic living things such as animals and plants, all right, and non-living, referring to things that are not alive or not made of cells, such as rocks or water or dirt or air. One thing we've learned about ecosystems is that they are always changing. And there are factors, which you previously hopefully learned were limiting factors or things that are happening in the environment to cause these changes. So we know that we can find ecosystems pretty much everywhere in the planet, in the water, on land, high up in the mountains. Ecosystems are everywhere. They're always changing, and it's always due to these limiting factors. Now, sometimes these factors are very slow, they're very small, and so they cause very slow and gradual changes. So we'll talk more about this, but things like annual floods or prey predator populations can cause very small fluctuations in an ecosystem. Other factors are very extreme, meaning that they happen in a very large way and they can happen very fast. And so as a result, they're going to cause the ecosystem to change in a very large way and very dramatically and quickly. And so that's really what we're going to kind of look at in this video review. And so before we move on, I just put two pictures of two different types of ecosystems just to give you a visual of what they look like. So you can see in the bottom right, that's something that you might find in a forest. Even it reminds me a little of Forest Park with maybe a few more organisms in there. But we can see several biotic things in that picture. We can see the elk, we can see the birds, the ducks. We can see all the different plants, the trees and the grass. Those are also biotic or living things. There's bacteria living in the water that we can't see, but those would be biotic as well. And there's probably mushrooms and other funguses growing in that picture as well that would be biotic. We can also see some abiotic things. We can see the water, namely as probably the largest one right there that is abiotic. We can see some rocks and some dirt, also abiotic. We can probably assume that there is air floating around there, even though we can't see it in the picture, and that would also be abiotic. In the top right picture, we can see an underwater ecosystem. And so we can, again, see a variety of biotic and abiotic things. So for biotic, we can see several fish. We can see a turtle. We can assume there's probably a coral reef somewhere in that picture that maybe we can't quite see, but it's on the bottom. We can see the birds, and we can assume there's bacteria there. And there's also plants. For abiotic, we can see some rocks, air, water, clouds, all those things being abiotic or non-living. So when we're talking about ecosystems, you can have these pictures in your mind, or you can think of some of the ecosystems that you live in or are surrounded by in your mind when we're talking about these things. Okay, and so our focus is, how do ecosystems change? And so I told you that fluctuations in the environment will dramatically change the ecosystem. And so before we get into this, one important thing to remember is what I have at the bottom right in bold there. The greater the biodiversity of an environment or of an ecosystem, the greater its resistance to change and the greater its resilience. Okay, when I say great biodiversity, what I mean is we want a lot of different types of species and abiotic and biotic things in a particular ecosystem. Having a great variety of the organisms that live there, and those organisms having a great variety in the traits that they have, that actually makes the ecosystem very strong. Because if something comes along to negatively affect that ecosystem, such as something like a great flood or a big fire, having all these different types of species and different traits means that some might be able to survive this change and that our ecosystem will live on and won't get destroyed. On the flip side of that, if we have an ecosystem that has very low biodiversity, meaning that there really isn't any variety in the species there, there's really one or two species that live there and they pretty much all have the same traits and look the same, well, that ecosystem is in danger and very vulnerable to changes. If there's a change that comes along and affects one of them, it's likely to affect all of them since we don't have much differences in them and a lot of their traits are the same. And so that could actually wipe out a complete ecosystem. So key things to remember is that The more variety we have of species in an ecosystem, and the more variety we have in their traits, the greater and stronger that ecosystem will be, and the better chance they have at recovering from any major changes. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at some of these changes. I already mentioned some small or moderate changes to you, like floods and small changes in predator-prey relationships. Hunting season is another one where we know humans have hunting season, and so we might see a small dip in some populations of organisms. Okay, but let's look at the extreme changes. Those are the things that really can make ecosystems vulnerable to losing a lot of organisms and possibly not recovering. So volcanic eruptions can cause huge detrimental effects to ecosystems. Large scale fires, not just the small ones, but really big ones, possibly like the ones we've talked about in California. Those can have really, really big effects on ecosystem. The loss of keystone species, we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a minute, but essentially the idea of this is that losing one organism or one species group can have a negative effect and a strong negative effect on all the other species that live in that area and can really mess up the food chain. Climate change. This is a huge one that I'm sure you've heard of at some point outside of the science class, because it's really taken a devastating toll on different ecosystems in the last 10, 20 years specifically. And then ocean acidification and sea level rise, those kind of come as another consequence to climate change. So we're going to get into all this and kind of how this has such a negative effect and can really change ecosystems in a large way. Okay, and then here's just a picture just to kind of show the chain effect of what a change can do to an ecosystem. So in this particular picture, all right, we can imagine this is an ecosystem. And so let's say that there's been a very long, severe drought. So that means no rain for an extended period of time, not just a small drought, but months worth. Okay, and so how can this affect the ecosystem? Well, in this picture, you can see some of the consequences or some of the effects to this ecosystem as a result of this long-standing extreme drought. So we can see that the trees, a lot of them, are no longer or are producing fruit at a very low levels, decreased fruiting of trees. So fruit is not being produced as much, if at all. So now what does that lead to? Well, whatever eats those fruit organisms, their populations are probably going down too because their food supply is being cut down. As we can see down here, right, there's water stress on plants. We're going to have some plants that are starting to die because we know that plants need water in order to do photosynthesis, which is how they make their food, glucose. If they can't get water, plants can't make glucose, their cells are going to start dying. And so if plants start dying, whatever eats those plants are also going to start dying off, okay? And that whole thing goes through for that food chain, okay? And so we see up here some of these trees are starting to die off as a result of lack of water. As another effect, we see some birds are starting to leave or their populations are declining because these birds might be eating this fruit. These birds live in the trees, and if the trees are dying off, they need to either leave and find a new place to live, or they're going to start starving. And so their populations are going to die out as well. So we can see, again, another chain effect. All right, we can see increased erosion. So if these trees are dying, they're going to start eroding and going into the water. Okay, and so if we have these molecules of the trees eroding into the water, well, those become solutes. And so what's going to happen is they're going to start affecting the water quality in this pond. And we see that the water level's already going down due to the drought. So we can imagine that the organism fish populations in this area are also going to start being negatively affected. We can imagine that the plants as well that were underwater, algae, other plants, are also going to be affected by this. So we're going to have issues with the food chain in the water as well. We can also see here that fires might start popping up because it is so dry and there's no water. And so we're going to lose more plant and animal probably populations due to fires. But then look here, there's a fire-resistant invasive plant. And so these plants won't get burned down. And so now we have a new problem. We might actually see that these plants are increasing because they're resistant to fires. And so that's going to affect the biodiversity, meaning that we're going to have a lot of these plants populating, and then these ones might all start dying. So we might be left with only one species of plant, which we talked about how low biodiversity does not make for a healthy ecosystem. All right, and then additionally of all this, you see I have this picture of this frog. This frog is extremely sensitive to switches in temperature and water. And so this amphibian frog species might completely die out, and we might actually have an extinct frog species in this particular ecosystem. So when I'm talking about this delicate balance of an ecosystem, this is what I mean, is that one thing, this long drought, can have several consequences to the ecosystem. And if it's very extreme, such as this, and long-standing, then we could actually really lose an ecosystem. And we definitely will lose the biodiversity of the ecosystem, and we will decrease it in a very significant way. Okay, and so let's talk about what a keystone species is. So any organism or any species group that is considered a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on the other species around it and the ecosystem itself. So this means that this particular species has a really, really big impact upon the food web or food chain that they exist in, and upon the overall health and functioning of the ecosystem. And so one example I'm giving you is sharks. Sharks are a well-known keystone species for aquatic ecosystems. And so let's talk about why the shark is so important, and then how with the removal of the shark, we can see the really negative effects that the ecosystem will have placed upon it. So in a healthy aquatic ecosystem, we see that there are coral reefs, and the coral reefs are largely associated with having a really healthy ecosystem and really high biodiversity. And so we want coral reefs. And so coral reefs can flourish when there are algae-eating fish available to eat the algae that might take the resources from the coral reef and overgrow the area. And so when we have these algae-eating fish, they eat the algae, which means that we have enough resources and space for the coral, and the coral will grow and flourish. And so who eats these algae-eating fish? Well, other predatory fish in the area. But luckily, in those areas are also sharks who eat the predatory fish. And so the sharks keep those predatory fishes populations in check so they don't get too big. And that means that the algae-eating fish populations can also stay in check, and we have enough of them to eat the algae, which means that the coral reef can flourish and continue to grow. So we see really here a really great food chain, right? And everyone kind of keeps each in check. So now let's say that the sharks are removed. So we know that some humans hunt sharks. And so let's say they start really over hunting extreme. And so we lose just a ton of sharks in a particular area. Well, what's going to happen now? Well, those predatory fish are now going to grow in great numbers. So they have no predator checking their populations. And so they're just going to grow and grow, and they're going to eat all of those algae-eating fish, the stuff that they like to eat. And so we're going to see our algae-eating fish populations decrease dramatically. Now, what happens when they decrease? Well, now the algae is not going to have many things eating it. And so the algae is just going to bloom and grow in crazy numbers, which means that the coral reef are now losing resources and space, and they are going to start decreasing in numbers and dying off. And without healthy coral reefs, the ecosystem itself is probably going to collapse. And so we see, just from the removal of the shark, a complete collapse of the ecosystem. So that's what we mean when we say keystone species, a species that if we remove it, the entire ecosystem could fold and the biodiversity can be wiped out. Okay, and so we've talked a bunch about different extreme changes to an ecosystem that can negatively affect its biodiversity. So we've looked at volcanoes, we talked briefly about it, fires and floods. We just talked about loss of keystone species. We're going to get into some more climate change, so changes in weather patterns and global temperatures. I'll go a little more into that, and about humans are the main cause of that. So we're negatively affecting ourselves and the ecosystems we live in, but we'll get more into that. And then ocean acidification. This is a decrease of the ocean's pH due to the burning of fossil fuels. And that goes hand in hand with climate change. And then sea level rise. We're seeing an increase in our ocean's water levels due to the melting of polar ice caps. Why are polar ice caps melting? Climate change, which is led by us. So we can see that a lot of these extreme changes happening to ecosystems right now, we have our hand in as humans that inhabit this population. We're having a largely disproportionately negative effect on the ecosystems around us. Okay, and so we're going to look a little more at climate change, but I'm going to mention a few other things that we humans are specifically doing to affect the ecosystems around us, biodiversity. And so some of the ones I'm going to discuss in a little more detail are habitat fragmentation, introduction of invasive and non-native species to an ecosystem, overharvesting an ecosystem, pollution to our ecosystems, and then climate change, the big one that I said I'd go back to. So let's look at these a little closer. Oh, right. So habitat fragmentation. What are we doing to the habitats, the ecosystems around us? Well, humans, we like to build. We like to make buildings and roads and amusement parks and all sorts of fun things. But where those things are located were ecosystems formerly. And so we are getting rid of ecosystems and therefore greatly decreasing biodiversity by wiping them out. And so if you look at the bottom left picture, you can see an example of, road built right in the middle of an ecosystem. And so you see some bird populations crossing it. But if you look to the bottom right, you kind of see why that decreases biodiversity. And so if you look here, right, this picture kind of shows one ecosystem. And so we see who lives in the middle of that ecosystem. So primarily bears and some birds here and other species. And then we see that other different species like frogs and rabbits kind of like to live on the outside of it. And so let's say then we need to build a nice big highway right through this ecosystem to get us places. And so we do that. And then there's our road or highway. But look what happened as we did that. We lost our bear species and we've decreased our bird species numbers. As you can see, the bear is nowhere to be found anymore, and we only have one yellow bird. And look, these organisms have been separated from each other. The yellow and the red organisms. And so they no longer can even interact. And so let's say, they were preys or predators, they competed for food, that's going to change the whole dynamic now of the food chains and webs that existed before. And so what we've done here essentially is we've split up ecosystems. So we're changing or disrupting the food chains and webs that exist there. We're taking away some of the resources because now in place of where plants and animals used to grow and live, we have a road that isn't going to provide anything for them. And so we've just lost species or decreased their numbers and decreased our biodiversity in that ecosystem as well. Also, invasive or non-native species. This is starting to have a very negative effect on ecosystems around the world. And so what are non-native species? Well, those are species that were introduced to an area and they are living there in that area, but are not originally from that area. So they've been brought, usually accidentally, from one area to another. And so what makes them invasive? Well, invasive is when they just start populating like crazy in an ecosystem and start negatively affecting all the other species around them. So they start overtaking that area, start decreasing the population numbers of species in that area, and therefore decreasing the biodiversity in that ecosystem as well. And so I'll just give you two examples. So I gave you a plant invasive species on the left, and then a insect invasive species on the right, which some of you might recognize. And so the one on the left is actually a bunch of blackberry plants. And so you might think blackberries aren't bad. They have those great fruits, blackberries. I buy them at the store. They taste good, and so they're not bad in nature, but they are bad in ecosystems because they can really overrun it and destroy it. And so blackberry plants were introduced from Asia some time ago, first introduced to the west coast of North America, and they really flourished in those areas. They were planted, flourished, and we found very quickly that they are much better at getting the resources they need and competing for space than other plants in that area. And so as a result, blackberry has grown acres upon acres upon acres in that area and overrun all the native plant species in that area. Also, blackberries can be very thorny, and so a lot of animals in that area don't really want to deal with the thorns and trying to get the fruits and eat it. So there's not many animals in that area that will eat it, which has also allowed blackberry to grow even more. In my 20s, I actually had a job out there where my whole job was to dig up blackberry plants. This was in Oregon. Dig up blackberry plants and then burn them in huge piles to try to get rid of them, because you would just look out and see acres of just blackberry plants everywhere. And you had to be very careful about doing it. Even if you left an inch of the root, it could grow back next year. So it's really, really invasive. And the ecosystems in that area, their biodiversity is decreasing because they're losing plant species. And then they're also losing animal species because the animals that feed on those plants are decreasing because they have no food and don't want to eat the blackberry. On the right, you can see what we refer to as the common stink bug, but it's actually called the brown marmorated stick bug. It's from Asia, typically areas like Japan or Korea or China, and it was also brought over here accidentally to North America's East Coast. And so we see a lot of these in the spring and actually the fall when they're trying to find areas to stay warm. They come into where we're living, and we know that they don't smell good at all. But these are considered very invasive insect species that we currently have that we're trying to keep their numbers down. They are growing tremendously because no one really wants to eat a stink bug. They don't taste very good, so many animals and birds kind of avoid them. They are eaten by other predatory stink bugs, but those are typically found in Asia, where they were from, and we don't really have a lot of those predatory stink bugs over here in North America. So they really don't have many predators, which is allowing them to just grow and reproduce in tremendous numbers. And they're really good at finding food. And they really like things like apples and pears and fruits, which we tend to have a lot of over here. And so farmers are really not enjoying the fact that these stink bugs are over here because they are wiping out like acres of their crops. And so they're finding food very easily. Not many things are eating them. So these stink bugs are just really starting to grow out of control, and they are affecting the ecosystems around us, because if they are taking all these resources, these fruits that they're eating, that means that other species that normally would eat those things are not getting to eat them. And so they are starving or they are leaving to find other ecosystems. And so our ecosystems here are losing biodiversity. It's decreasing. All right, overharvesting and pollution. So again, like the previous two, humans have had some impacts or direct control in these areas. All right, and by overharvesting, I mean the top left picture, all those fish there. Humans are overharvesting animals. And so we know that, we like to eat things like lobster and salmon and cod and all these, underwater aquatic organism populations. They taste good and they are good to eat. But what we're seeing is that farmers are harvesting them from the oceans in big numbers, more than we could eat. And so a lot of them are just dying. They're not getting bought to eat. They're dying off, getting thrown away, but we keep over harvesting and over harvesting. And so the problem with this is that we're taking so many of these salmon or cod or tilapia fish or lobsters or oysters that they're actually getting pulled and getting wiped out of their aquatic food webs and food chains. And so the organisms that would eat these things underwater are losing their food. And so we're affecting populations. We're decreasing populations by wiping them out. And then we're affecting the organisms that they're a part of a food web or food chain, the ones that would eat them, or we're affecting the populations of what these salmon or these oysters would eat. And so we're really shaking up the aquatic ecosystems and decreasing biodiversity by constantly pulling these aquatic organisms out of the environment and decreasing their numbers. Pollution is another one. Pollution is affecting us as humans negatively, but we're affecting the ecosystems as well. And so if you look at those two pictures, the one top right and bottom right, those are just two different examples of pollution. So I'll start the one with the bottom right, where we can see obviously all the carbon dioxide and fossil fuels burning and getting put back into the atmosphere. So this is contributing to climate change and global warming, which I'll get to in a little bit. Also remember that those are toxins, so we're breathing that in, and any organism in an ecosystem is also breathing that in. And so you can imagine that that's having a negative effect on them anyway, to breathe all these toxins in. This could kill some of them. This could start decreasing our plant and animal species. And then, of course, we always go back to that affects the food web, food chains, and that's going to affect the ecosystem overall and decrease biodiversity. The top right picture is actually showing a landfill. And so we see this is the trash that humans are making, plastics and the garbage that we take out, and cardboard and food waste and all the stuff that we throw out in the trash. Well, it has to go somewhere. It doesn't disappear once it's taken from our living area. And so this is where it goes. It goes to a landfill. Now remember, when you're looking at that landfill picture, that was once an ecosystem. we had to clear that forest or whatever was there, wipe out those trees, the grass, kick out all the animals and organisms that were living there so that it was just a barren, flat dirt area that we could dump trash on. So not only have we wiped out ecosystems to pollute in landfills, but we continue to do it. And so we're just taking up more and more ecosystems to keep filling with more and more trash that we keep producing. So when we talk about pollution, there's really not just one type of way we pollute, but a wide range of it. We put stuff into the air, we make landfills, we dump chemicals and trash in some of the waters, which negatively affects ecosystems that are underwater. So there's all these different areas that we are really doing pollution in. And that's affecting biodiversity in a very negative way for our ecosystems. And back to climate change, which I feel like a lot of these other things that happen kind of all come under climate change. And so what is climate change? So this is the general temperature change and temperature rising globally due to some of the things that I just mentioned, pollution of the air, pumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases back into the air, things like that. And so what we're seeing is that because we keep burning all these fossil fuels, putting all these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide into the air at really, really high numbers, what that's doing, the buildup of that is causing the global temperature to rise. It's getting hotter. And so as the temperature is getting hotter, that is affecting ecosystems. All right. The temperature is getting warmer. So we're going to see more water evaporation. We see that the polar ice caps are now starting to melt. And so that's what the bottom left picture shows. We see the polar bears and they're on a little slab of ice. Those slabs of ice used to be huge slabs of ice that stretched miles and miles. That's what we called the polar ice caps. And so now they've melted. And so they went from ice to water. And so that waters went into the oceans. That's changed the pH of the ocean, which has had a negative effect on some species that live in the ocean. A lot of fish species cannot survive if their pH changes even slightly. And so we've seen some fish species die off, and that's affected their food webs and chains. With adding water from the ice caps into the ocean, we see the sea level is rising. And so that's negatively affecting, it's flooding some ecosystems, which is wiping out some species. And again, that's changing the aquatic ecosystems in a negative way. So that's affecting those species in the water as well. So we're having just all these really negative effects from climate change, and something that we could reverse. And I think we are trying to do that. Humans are starting to realize this, but not everyone is on board with that. And so we can reverse it, but we have to do it soon because the temperature is going to keep rising if we keep polluting and burning fossil fuels and putting these CO2 and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so how do we solve these problems? Well, humans, like I said, we're starting to catch on. We need to change what we're doing. We can change and reverse global warming and climate change. We can restore ecosystems. And so what we're starting to see now is more humans taking action in doing that. And so some of the solutions that we've come up for the problems that we have kind of caused with this are as follows. They are captive breeding programs, habitat restoration, pollution mitigation, energy conservation, and ecotourism. And so we'll talk about each of these and kind of what they are and how they are helping to undo some of the stuff that we've done with human consequences to ecosystems. Okay, and so let's just go through some of these. So one of the things we are starting to do is have captive breeding programs. And so these are largely run by and programs, but they look at which species are really endangered and very much in jeopardy of going extinct. And they bring them to their zoos to breed and have them reproduce and rebuild their population. Or they bring them to their conservation areas where they have protected land, where they can bring, the small amount or small number of species left, allow them to breed, allow them to reproduce without any predators or any, hunters poaching. Other factors that could negatively affect them, and just allow them to rebuild their populations. And so we've been able to successfully bring back population numbers for certain species and then release them back into some of their native areas. Another one is habitat restoration. So again, a lot of these, zoos, but largely for habitat restoration, conservation groups and nonprofits are going into ecosystems that have been damaged, sometimes by human efforts and sometimes by just natural limiting factors like a really big drought or a volcanic eruption or something really dramatic. And they are helping rebuild the damaged parts of those ecosystems. So they're planting plants that used to live there that maybe got wiped out. They're getting rid of algae that has overrun. They're reintroducing animal species that could restore the food chains and food webs that had fallen apart due to whatever this disruption of the habitat was. And so we see that humans are trying to play a more direct role now in reestablishing the balance that existed in this ecosystem or this habitat before whatever the negative factor was that threw the balance off and started decreasing the biodiversity. And so in some ecosystems, we really have been able to restore the balance and increase biodiversity by having this direct hand in adding these species back or planting or getting rid of invasive species, but kind of controlling a little bit what's happening in there and trying to rebuild it. Another one that we've caught on to is getting rid of pollution or decreasing pollution, also known as pollution mitigation. So we finally realized that pollution, particularly air pollution, isn't good for us and is really not good for our ecosystems and its biodiversity. And so we've come up with a number of solutions ranging from really small changes that, the everyday person could do to some bigger ones that, larger groups of people or governments can take part in that will bring down the pollution that's being put out there. And so we can see that some of the solutions, a lot of it is just energy efficient energy. So that's solar energy, that's wind energy, that's putting on regulations to businesses of how much pollution they can put in the air and forcing them to decrease that and look for cleaner options. That's in cities, making buildings and stuff we're building more energy efficient and compact so they're not taking up as much space and we don't have to get rid of as many ecosystems. That's providing access to clean, affordable fuels for people. And it's promoting ways that we as individual humans can be cleaner by, even doing something like biking instead of driving our car and not putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, or what we call is decreasing our carbon footprint. Using solar panels on houses or on buildings. Some buildings in cities are actually starting to have eco gardens where on the roofs they're planting these big gardens because we know that plants will pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis and then release oxygen into the atmosphere after they've done photosynthesis. So that kind of helps them and us. So there's all these different ways that we're trying to be more efficient, and that is actually helping us decrease the amount of pollution going into our air. And going hand in hand with that, energy conservation has also really been pushed more in our society now than it has ever before, and that's sustainable energy or green energy. So we see that it's happening on really big scales or really small scales, and we're hearing a lot more about it in the media, which is great. And so we know that a big focus in a lot of countries right now is coming up with renewable energy. So solar energy, wind energy, geothermal energy, and even biomass energy. So using other things and organisms like in biomass to actually generate energy. And we can even do, small things too, right? It doesn't have to be this big scale, creating new energy, renewable energy resources. We can do things like buy energy efficient applications, use LED lighting, having improved insulation in our house. And in even smaller scale, we can do things like just turning off our lights and turning off, things in our house that are pulling energy during the day that we're not using during the day. Keeping our thermostats down, unplugging any appliances that we just aren't using, and even taking a shorter shower can help with conserving energy and not wasting it. And so the last one is ecotourism. And so this is kind of like what we know as traditional tourism with a nice, sustainable, healthy spin. So we know that normal tourism, you would be visiting, mostly man-made places like Disney World or going to an amusement park or going to a city far away from you. Ecotourism is visiting areas that have natural balanced environments and ecosystems. And these people will take you on tours to show you these ecosystems and rainforests, but not allow you to change anything in that ecosystem. So really, you're just taking a tour of it and getting to appreciate the ecosystem and the balance of it. And the hope is that once you've seen it, you'll be able to go and tell people about it, what you saw, and how we want to conserve the ecosystems, or that you might be motivated to help in the conservation effort and start taking part in their conservation efforts through either helping them or donating to their cause. But really getting the message out there that we need to appreciate our ecosystems, they're beautiful, and you should help in some way, shape, or form. And so we see a lot of this happening in areas like the Philippines, Costa Rica, Panama, just to name a few. A lot of them have done pretty cool things where they've made zip lines through their ecosystems. And so they don't get rid of any, it doesn't take a lot to put up the zip line. They don't get rid of any species by doing it, but you can zip line through a whole ecosystem and get to see what it looks like. And then you can go spread the message and say what you saw and, donate to their conservation effort or help in their conservation effort, or get the word out that it's a beautiful thing and we need to maintain it. You saw it, and people should help. And so that's kind of the gist of all the ways that humans are starting to help and trying to undo some of the things that have affected negatively the ecosystems and decreased their biodiversity. So now that we've kind of talked through that, just to kind of, if you want some practice before the MCAS of thinking through how you might have to use this information on the MCAS, let's just do a practice question. So let's think back to February 2021. Some of you might be familiar with this if you had heard the news or watched the news at all, but Texas had a historic snowstorm and cold snap. So they had several days of snow and just really, really cold temperatures, something they really never see. And so this was extremely uncommon for this area. And so this caused freezing cold temperatures, below average, well below, and power outages and water supply issues. And you heard this talked about on the news for days and nights, is that people lost power, their pipes froze, so they couldn't get any water. When things started de-thawing, the pipes burst, so they ended up having floods in their houses and still couldn't get any clean water. And it was really just a big mess for humans. And so we heard a lot about this. What we didn't hear a lot about was the effect on the ecosystems in this area. So we know, Texas is a very big state and they have a wide range of ecosystems with animals, with plants. And so if humans had snow and freezing cold temperatures, so did these animals. And so let's think, what effect do you think this cold snap had on Texas's ecosystems? So what effect do you think it had on the plant species that live in those ecosystems, on the animal species, on the food chains, on the food webs? And then what actions could people in Texas take to restore the ecosystem's balance? So you could think about this just from what you know right now. You could do some research to see what types of organisms live in Texas and then come up with an answer. But really think it through and think about what we talked about for this video review, what you've learned about in Unit 7, and take that information and see if you can come up with some well-written answers to these two questions. And I hope today was helpful, and good luck on the MCAS exam.